Okay, our next discussion is going to be on chemical messengers. And so what we're going to be doing next is we're going to be looking at intercellular communication. So in other words, how do cells communicate with one another? So here is cell 1 and here is cell 2. How do these two cells talk to each other? Just remember, inter means between. So this is communication between two cells. If our cells did not communicate to one another, you would not be able to listen to somebody when they spoke to you. You wouldn't be able to take lecture notes. You basically wouldn't be able to do anything because cellular communication is one of the necessary or fundamental things for survival. And so cells have to communicate just like people have to communicate. So there are a couple different types of communication. There's what we call direct communication and indirect communication. And in a moment, I'll be discussing those and comparing those for you. And then we have functional classification and chemical classification of our chemical messengers. So basically what a chemical messenger is the same thing as a ligand. And this is what we use to communicate between one cell and another cell. You have to have a chemical messenger to do that. One cell will produce that ligand, the other cell will respond to that ligand. Okay, so in addition to those ligands, we need to know how are they synthesized and how do they get released from a secretory cell. We need to know how the chemical messenger gets transported and what that target cell interaction is. So in other words, once that chemical messenger reaches a target cell, how does the target cell respond? So here is our chapter outline. And what we're going to be doing is breaking these chemical messengers. Remember, chemical messengers are called ligands. We're going to break them down into two different means by which we classify them. We classify them based on their function. So in other words, do they function as a paracrine signaler? Do they function as a neurotransmitter? Or do they function as a hormone? Or does that chemical messenger function as a neurohormone? Then what we're going to do is we're going to look at their chemical classification. So by chemical classification, we're going to take these chemical messengers and we're going to divide them up into different groups or into different chemical classes. So we'll divide them up into eicosanoids, amino acids, amines, peptides and proteins, and steroids. So if you understand the chemical property for each of these chemical classes, then you will understand how that chemical messenger is synthesized and released or secreted from a secretory cell, which will allow you to understand how that chemical messenger gets transported to the target cell. And it will help you understand where the receptor will be located with respect to the target cell. And finally, knowing the chemical property is going to allow you to understand how the target cell responds. So just by knowing the chemical property, you're going to be able to figure out all of these other entities that are part of intercellular communication. So to give you a larger picture of what this would look like, two cells. So here's my secretory cell. Here is my target cell. So we have these two different cells, and these two cells have to be able to communicate to one another. So the secretory cell has to synthesize and secrete the ligand. Remember, the ligand is also the chemical messenger. Once that occurs, then the ligand has to be transported to the target cell. And once the ligand gets to the target cell and binds to the receptor, then the target cell will respond. So if you understand the chemical property, meaning is the chemical messenger lipophobic or lipophilic, you will be able to determine if the secretory cell, how the secretory cell synthesizes and secretes that ligand, how that ligand gets transported, and lastly, how that target cell will respond to that ligand. So to begin with intracellular communication, what we need to do is first off, for you to understand the differences between direct communication and indirect communication. So in direct communication, your cells are physically connected. And they're physically connected via a structure that you are already fondly familiar with, and those are gap junctions. So be sure that you remember what a gap junction is. A gap junction is like a drinking straw. It connects these two cells. These two cells have to communicate. So they're communicating through this gap junction. So whatever solute needs to pass through to get to the other cell in order for them to communicate. So that solute, whatever it is, has to travel through the gap junction. Remember that the gap junction is composed of two different types of proteins, the connexon and the connexin. The entire thing is called the connexin. Each cellular unit of the gap junction is called a connexon. So, indirect communication, these two cells are physically connected. If it's indirect communication, now the two cells are not physically connected. So what that means is that your ligand, or your chemical messenger, whichever you prefer to call it, the ligand has to be transported to the target cell. That target cell may be close by the secretory cell, but not physically connected, or the target cell may be farther away. Again, just to give you the overview here, here's the secretory cell. It's going to synthesize and secrete your ligand. The ligand, once it gets secreted, right, has to be transported, and then it has to reach the target cell. When it reaches the target cell, it binds to the receptor, and once it binds to the receptor, you get some sort of response. So that is the big picture of what indirect communication is. These two cells are not physically connected. All right, so then when we move into functional versus chemical classification, so how do we classify this messenger that has to be secreted from a secretory cell and has to go to a target cell? So we have two different ways we can do this. We can use what's called the functional classification. Like I said earlier, it's how does the chemical messenger function? Does it function as a paracrine signaler, as a neurotransmitter, as a hormone, or as a neurohormone? We'll be discussing each of these shortly. Then we have the chemical classification. And again, if you know the chemical property of your ligand, you will understand, and things will be so much easier for you if you understand that. So just a quick review. If my ligand is lipophilic, it is hydrophobic. And if my ligand is lipophobic, it is hydrophilic. So we have various classes of chemical messengers. So here are the various classes. They include amino acids, amines, peptides and proteins, steroids, and eicosanoids. So this concludes the overview of the intercellular communication chapter,